Good morning. We're going to start this morning with a look at 2 Corinthians 6, verses 14 and 15. And Paul writes in that, he says, "Don't become partners with those who do not believe, for what partnership is there between righteousness and lawlessness? Or what fellowship does light have with darkness? What agreement does Christ have with Belial? Or what does a believer have in common with an unbeliever?" I'll never forget the first time that I was teaching on this passage. I was in Bible college at the time and had gotten a part-time weekend youth ministry at a small church in Indiana. I hadn't been there very long when I met a girl that was around my age. And we started talking. We eventually dated for a little while. And she would come to youth group on Sunday nights to help out and to hang out with me a little bit. Now, I'm teaching on this passage one night, and I read that verse in other translations that says, "Do not be unequally yoked." I'm sure most of you are probably more familiar with that. And I read through that, and she just flat out stated in front of all the kids that I was trying to teach, "I don't agree with what the Bible says right there." It kind of caught me off guard, but I was blinded by infatuation or love or whatever you want to call it at the time, and I didn't really argue with her in front of the kids. In fact, sad to say, I didn't even go back and argue with her later on it, but thankfully she ended up ending things with me before it got a whole lot worse. But that was just one of my first memories of this passage when I was looking at it for this week. But I was thinking, what's the definition of yoke? What do you know as the again, my translation that I read from doesn't use that term, but most of us know that this passage as not being unequally yoked, that Paul is writing that. So I went and found a picture of a yoke. Some of you farmers probably are very familiar with that. I knew what they looked like, but I've never used one. But a yoke, a definition that was online for what a yoke is a wooden crosspiece that is fastened over the necks of two animals and attached to the plow or cart that they are to pull. But that got me thinking, what does it mean to be yoked together as person to person, though? We said last week that in our marriages we should be partners. That not one spouse ruling over another with an iron fist, but partners with different but equally important roles. So we are tied together, we're yoked together, we work together. And if we're unequal, then that work gets harder and harder to accomplish. So before we go any further, since we had a little bit of technical difficulties last week, I want to go back to a couple of the graphics that I had planned on showing. The first one is some statistics about family members making a decision to surrender to Christ. Who makes that decision first? And if the dad comes to Christ first in a family, then 93% of that family will come to Christ. If mom comes first, only 17%. Okay, stay on that first one. And then finally, if the kids are the first ones in the family to come to Christ, only 3.5% of the family will come to know Christ at some point. The next set of statistics are the longevity of faith among kids. If kids are attending church by themselves, neither parent attending, you can go ahead and put that next one up. Only 6% of those kids that attend on their own will continue in their faith later in life. If the mom attends with the kids, only about 15% of those kids will continue later on in their life. If dad attends alone with the kids, 55% of those children will remain faithful. But it jumps to 72% if both mom and dad attend with the kids. That's a significant increase. So we can see how important it is for both mom and dad to be faithful, to be a Christian, and it has great effect on the kids. But what happens when one spouse or one parent is a Christ follower and the other isn't. In our first passage that we looked at this morning, it would seem that Paul is saying that we shouldn't enter into partnerships with someone who isn't a Christian if we are. Now, in the context, this passage really isn't even talking about romantic or marriage relationships. Paul was talking about false prophets in this. But while 2 Corinthians 6 isn't necessarily speaking to unequal marriages, it's important to note that at this time and throughout church history, Christ followers were not supposed to be marrying non-Christ followers. It was not accepted in the church, so that's why he probably wasn't even addressing it at the time. But what happens if we mess up? What happens if we find ourselves in a relationship with somebody that's not a Christian? What should we do if we find ourselves in that situation where we are unequally yoked in a marriage? First, I think it's important to point out that there are different stages of being unequally yoked. For those of you that are single, I want to point this out. Make sure that if you start dating, that the person that you're with shares your faith and your commitment, first and foremost. But for those of you that may be different or may be in different stages, again, this is my opinion, but I think there are different levels of stages of being unequally yoked. First, we have one person who's a Christ follower who is strong in their faith, and they may be with someone who does not claim to be a Christ follower at all, whether it be that they believe in a different religion or that they claim to be an atheist. But you have that unequal marriage there. The second would be a Christ follower who, again, is strong in their faith and committed, and they're with someone who says that they believe in God, but they don't act out on that belief at all. They claim to be a Christian or claim to believe in God, but they don't put anything into practice. And finally, again, another Christ follower who is strong in their faith, and they're with someone who claims to believe, and they may even try to put a little bit of effort in, but they just don't have the full commitment of giving their life to Christ. But let's look at another passage where Paul is actually writing that deals with marriages that include one believer and one non-believer. And that's in 1 Corinthians 7, verses 10 through 16. And Paul writes, "To the married I give this command, not I, but the Lord. The wife is not to leave her husband, but if she does leave, she must remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. And a husband is not to divorce his wife. But I, not the Lord, say to the rest, if any brother has an unbelieving wife, and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. Also, if any woman has an unbelieving husband, and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce her husband. For the unbelieving husband is made holy by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy by the husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the unbeliever leaves, let him leave. A brother or a sister is not bound in such cases. God has called you to live in peace. Wife, for all you know, you might save your husband. And husband, for all you know, you might save your wife." So Paul's writing to couples here that were more than likely, they were not Christians when they got married. And now one of them has made a decision to become a Christian and the other hasn't. That's because, again, in the church, it wasn't allowed at the time for Christians to marry non-Christians. So he's writing to people who were non-Christians, they got married, and one of the partners has become married. Has become a Christian. And that was what his instructions were to them. And notice what he doesn't say there. He doesn't say just completely give up on the relationship and leave. He says to stay in those marriages, to stay committed to those marriages. But if the non-believer wants to leave, he says not to try to force them to stay. While Paul is writing again about couples that were both non-believers before marriage, I think we can apply what he says here to those that may find themselves in a relationship with one committed Christian and one that's not so committed, even if that was the case before they were married. Should Christians knowingly enter into a relationship or into a marriage with a non-believer? No, I don't think so. But we shouldn't try to fix that mistake with another mistake by divorce. So if we find ourselves in an unequally yoked marriage, what should we do? First and foremost, stay committed to the relationship. Now, I want to point out something here. I'm not saying that if there's abuse or if there's adultery to stay in those marriages. I'm not saying that. But if there's not those situations going on, stay committed to the relationship. Work on it. Try to win your spouse over. Pray for the non-believing spouse. Pray that their heart will be softened, that they will come to seek what they see that you found in Christ. Be an example of what a Christ follower is supposed to be. Be the best partner in your marriage that you can be. Find ways to show them Christ every day, whether it's with your words or your actions, or both. But then I think it's also important to caution here, don't just beat them over the head with it, nag them, and completely badger them with it, because that could eventually turn them off to Christ altogether. I attended a funeral this past week of a man that I didn't know. I know some of the family, so I went as a support for them. One of the stories that was told of this man is relevant to our discussion this morning. And I reached out to one of the grandsons, and he gave me permission to share this story with you. It was told that this man had met a woman that he was interested in, and she was interested in him as well. But she, from the beginning of the relationship, flat out told him from the beginning that if she was going to agree to date him, then he had to be a committed Christian. He absolutely had to be committed to Christ. He had been raised as a Christian, but he had not really followed through with that relationship as an adult. So this ultimatum, for lack of a better term, clicked for him. He became very serious in his relationship with Christ. He eventually was baptized, and he lived the rest of his life as a fully committed Christian because this woman was committed to only being in a marriage with someone who was a Christian. You see, we're supposed to be partners with one another in our marriages. And that's what strengthens our marriages more than anything, when we can partner together, when we can actually be partners. But when one spouse is a Christ follower and one is not, that makes that partnership harder, doesn't it? There may be different goals in our marriage if one spouse is a Christian and one is not. And being true partners becomes that much harder when goals are different. I like to think about it this way. I'm a sports guy, so think about a sports team. If the individuals on the team are focused more on individual stats and goals more than they are being the best teammates that they can be, the team's going to suffer for that. That's why sometimes you can have a team that has the most individual talent that ends up getting beat by a team that is a better team, that functions better as a team, because again, being united for a common goal all too often is more important than individual talent. So what should the goal be in a marriage? Simply put, honoring Christ in all that we do. But if one partner is not a Christian or is not truly committed to being a Christian, then honoring Christ in everything becomes that much harder. So we've already looked at how difficult it is for kids and for families to remain faithful if none or only one of the spouses or parents is a Christian. I'll use this later in the series as we talk more in depth about keeping God first, but I wanted to show this today because it's why it's so important to have both spouses in a marriage be committed to God. Go ahead and put that next one up. I use this in marriage ceremonies often as well, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with it. But if you think of your relationship as that triangle with the husband on one corner, the wife on the other, and God at the top, the closer you individually get to God, what happens? The closer you get to each other and strengthen your marriage as well. Because we are tied together, so to speak, in our marriages. Again, we're tasked with partnering together. And if we are Christ followers, the closer that each of us gets to Christ, then the closer we come to one another as well. It's not always easy to be yoked or to be tied together with someone, is it? It's not always easy to do that. But it's easier when we're not a divided house. There's another yoke that we have in our lives as well. And it's one that our marriages are actually a foreshadowing of. We as Christians are the bride of Christ. And in that sense, we are yoked to Him. Or at least we should be. And as His yoke should be a comfort for us as well. In fact, Jesus said the following in Matthew 11:28 through 30. He says, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take up my yoke and learn from me, because I am lowly and humble in heart. You will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, my burden is light." As I wrap up, this idea, if your marriage is struggling, if you're wearied, if you're burdened, if your spouse isn't as committed to Christ as you are or as you would like them to be, come to Jesus. He can and He will give you rest. A divided home is not ideal, but but if you find yourself in an unequally yoked marriage, pray constantly. Be an encourager. Find ways to serve your spouse. Show them Jesus daily. But most importantly, focus on your relationship with Jesus first and foremost. Who knows? Your spouse might just come to Jesus through your work. If you have any decision to make this morning, now's the time to do so as we stand and sing, "Are You Washed in the Blood?" number 330. We'll be singing the first and the fourth.